and welcome to Let's Talk About Wargames, the podcast where we talk about Wargames. I'm Jack, and with me here today, as always, is Joe.
Hello.
We got a 4-time streak going of, co-hosting, and I think that's a pretty good streak. Let's see if we can keep the ball rolling here.
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about doing this whole podcast thing with you. I think we should make it a regular thing.
Maybe more than once a month, but this one would actually be the second one in a month if we get it out on time.
Mm-hmm.
And today, actually, on that note, we have a special episode planned, not like the very special episode from last time that's talking about something, in our community at present, but more so themed for the season. We're doing a Halloween episode.
Yeah, a fun thing for once.
Isn't this fun? And, for our fun thing, we're talking about the most gruesome and horrible things you can imagine. So buckle up, everyone.
I guess fun is relative, isn't it, here?
Yeah. What we're talking about today is Wargames and horror. So how games in our beloved field will include horror as a concept in their games, and ones that do it well and ones that don't do it so well. Because something that we kind of realize is that, a lot of war games that we play will cover these big events that are objectively, terrible, but it doesn't really feel like it if you're, the omnipotent guy at 10,000 feet looking down on the army, just seeing some guy get stabbed. That's not a horrifying experience for the player, as it would be for X guy getting stabbed that you're not playing as.
Yeah, I think something interesting we can talk about is whether or not that is something good or something that, we think we could work on in war games as a whole, about bringing that kind of heaviness and horror to the grand strategy and the tactical strategy games where you're looking down on your people from on high and not, in the trenches. Because there's a lot that could be done to try and make that more tactile, that sense of horror, that sense of fear that is common to every single period of armed conflict in human history, but it seems to be massively downplayed. And I think we can talk about this too if you want, downplayed the further back in time you go. Like, the horrors of war seem to disappear as we go into colorful uniforms and into antiquity and the Middle Ages and whatnot.
Yeah,
and that's really not true, right?
Yeah, I mean, the entirety of Caesar being in Gaul, for example, was just kind of a genocide, more or less, but it isn't painted as such, and people don't think of it today as that. And I think that it's part of the moral relativism that people are willing to say, like, oh, well, back then, people, it was different. It was like people had a different, like, conceptual understanding of things. It's like people saying in the 1800s, like, oh, well, they didn't know well enough to not be racist and own slaves or whatever. It's like, no, they knew. And even, in fact, for the Caesar and Gaul example, even the Roman Senate at the time issued orders to try to pull Caesar out because they were like, hey, what the hell are you doing? This is atrocious. So, I think that there's something to be said with us not wanting to humanize them too much, make them to not make them too relatable to what we are now, because we don't want to think about it like that.
Yeah, and then there's stages of that kind of historical relativism where we can look back and see how were people responding to these acts that we find atrocious these days. Like, when you look at what's our good old buddy Christopher Columbus, when you look at how the Europeans were talking about him, what he was doing was horrible. Like, there's a level above and beyond the thinking along the style of the time. But yeah, that going into Caesar and Gaul and the whole Roman military experiment, I feel like we're only really exposed to it, especially in games, in the hyper sterilized red tunic and was it segmentum armor? I'm not a classicist, you know what I mean?
The fun shirt and dress that they wore.
Yeah, like, it's distilled down to this uniform of air quote civilization against hordes of barbarians, and that's okay in people's minds because it is so far removed from the physical and tribal issues that we're dealing with today, right?
Yeah, and a lot of these people aren't really representative of anyone that's today. If it was like today, the way that they depict the Germanic peoples or the Britannic peoples or the Gallic peoples would be probably pretty dang racist. But you know, it's not, and therefore, I mean, because the Romans survived and won and got to write the histories about it, they got to portray them however they wanted. So
Hmm.
there's that.
So do we have any games off the top of your head that do or don't do ancient warfare and horror well?
Well, I don't know. The thing is that it's hard to do for ancient games because there's not really that many that I would say put the player in a position where they personally could feel afraid. For example, let's talk about Total War Rome 2 here real quick. Because this is, it's one of the more popular Ancients war games, I would say, probably the most popular one
Yeah,
overall.
still being played with
And
mods these days.
yeah, I mean, ever like so many people played this. If you're in the community, you've played it or heard about it at least. And uh, it's got two key battles I wanted to mention. The first one is Cannae. During the Second Punic War, famously, Hannibal of the Carthaginians lured the Romans into basically double enveloping themselves by the Carthaginians formed an inverted V and had the Romans push towards the middle of his line. And then they pushed the line back, and just kind of the wings of the V just ended up going around the Roman army, and they enveloped the whole thing and more or less killed all of them. With, not actually, but that's what the Roman sources want you to believe anyway. But sources at the time talk about people being packed in, unable to defend themselves, or in cases even like breathe, just because they were packed in so tight, and they just had to wait for the Carthaginians to come in and, kill that person next. Horrifying experience, but in the game, it's, first of all, I want to say, like, one of the big problems with the Total War games in terms of simulating actual history is just that the numbers aren't there.
Mm.
Because in Total War you get like 160 guys in one of your small units, and that's it. That's like the max amount of guys you can have. And in reality, there were there were over 100,000 people in that field fighting each other. And in Total War, it's like, I don't know, maybe 2,000 on each side. You kind of lose a lot of the scale, and that's kind of key to, I think, understanding and feeling the actual kind of fear you would get from that battle, because the stakes are a lot lower. And I don't know, Rome 2 doesn't do a very good job at like making you care about your individual soldiers.
Yeah, so visually it's not representing the battle correctly, not in
Yeah,
scale and then not in how we see our soldiers engaging. And I'm sure a lot of that is or was anyways, when was that 2011 2012 when that came out, like
I
technical.
think so.
But I could be way off at that date. I don't know when Rome 2 came out. But
Well, the thing is that Rome 2, it might have actually been a little bit later, but it also has the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, and this one they themed a lot more correctly, I would say. Thematically, it feels much more scary, I guess is the right word for it.
mm,
Because you've Total War has done ambushes pretty well recently, because as you start to get ambushed, if you're in that unit, you go down and follow like the general's unit, just kind of plodding along at like eye level more or less, and then the enemies just like appear from the sides and then throw stuff at you. And Teutoburg Forest in the game takes place at night, and it's in the woods, and there's some fog, and it's spooky. And then suddenly, as you're walking along with your legion, suddenly there's like thousands of German units just running at your guys, rolling these flaming balls of hay and whatever down the hill into your ranks. And it's really intense. And I wouldn't say that it's scary, but it is much more thematically appropriate to the thing, and much, I would say it puts you in the shoes of someone on the field better than the canny one does.
mm. So then again, the things you said there that made you feel it worked better to convey the horror of the experience is the mood, right? You're down at eye level following your guy. There's misty, it's dark, and then suddenly you're surrounded, and that's a problem. Whereas the other one is treated more like a traditional Total
Yeah,
War
it's
battle
just
where you're pulled back and looking down from the top, right?
Yeah, it's an encounter battle. And I think that just because it's in the woods, it feels more claustrophobic. You feel closer to the action and everything.
Hmm.
And the goal of it isn't to just beat the other army like the canny one. The goal is, because you're just playing the Romans in this, it's a set scenario where you can only play the Romans. The goal is to just take your army and just evacuate as many guys as possible. So it's not, so you just can't win. You have to leave,
Hmm.
is the whole gist of the thing. And so it has takes an entirely different tone to the whole battle as opposed to something like the canny one does.
See, I find this whole thing interesting because I haven't really sat down and thought about how strategy war games are dealing with, the psychological impact of these battles on the soldiers that you're commanding. Because so few games, if any, actually try and deal with it. I mean, no games are going to be, that I know of, are sitting down and talking about post-traumatic stress disorder or
Yeah, they're not
dealing with
modeling
wounds.
PTSD in your units.
Hmm. Now, some smaller games, smaller scale games are like and we talked briefly about the fantasy game Darkest Dungeon, where you do see
Hmm.
these psychological issues manifesting in your soldiers, and then another company made one set in a historical setting called Warsaw, which is basically the exact same game but set during the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, and you see your individually named and backstory given soldiers being hurt and psychologically traumatized by the battle. So it's possible to do, but as with, in contrast with the Roman example, I think we're seeing that you need to really hone in on individuals to convey that kind of horror, and that's something that's just really difficult to do in traditional strategy war games.
Right. Well, yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, for the Roman example, you have the more RPG focused Legionary's Life, which in our notes I saw that you wrote that one down. I think that was a good example
Hmm.
because that is something that you can kind of get more of a. I wouldn't say that you ever feel scared while playing that one either, but you get more of a sense of nervousness or what have you, like the general qualities that a horror would put in you than you would as you're pulled back general in Total War, because you don't care about your individual soldier climbing up the wall first to try to get up to the top of this wall, and some guys are beating down on him with clubs like 50 feet up in the air.
Hmm.
You don't care about him, but I mean that was a thing that happened, and I think that Legionary's Life would show that better than Total War.
Yeah, I hadn't played that game, but it was on my radar for a while.
It's pretty neat. It's not really something in our normal repertoire, but it's a neat little management slash combat RPG game. It's pretty interesting, and I would recommend checking it out. I really wish that they had put more content into it, because it's something that I think that could be the model could be taken and used in a lot of different scenarios. But I'm getting off topic by talking about this one. Um, so we talked a little bit about ancient games that just try to set the setting a little bit, but just for a couple of other examples of how war games have attempted to show these scenarios and kind of failed at setting the tone, is Napoleon's campaigns in Russia. Because at the time when Napoleon with the Grand Armée went into Russia, they didn't have proper supplies set up, and that kind of set the stage for the invasion overall failing. Because they went into Poland, which wasn't entirely friendly to them at the time, and they just went in and basically ate everything that wasn't nailed down, and that was their supply system. And then as further troops would trickle in from all over Europe, because they have the army was made up of um, different nation states all over Europe, they would go and just eat what was there, which is the crumbs of what was left before them. And so it was just a series of months long starvation, along with the cold of the Russian winter. Famously, it's almost like I almost feel bad for saying at this point. It's like a cliche. It's like the Russian winter is cold. It's like, yeah, no shit, Jack. But uh, so there's people freezing to death. There's people starving to death. Not to mention the people who are killed in combat or wounded, and then will probably die or be maimed otherwise by uh, what happened to them. And after a series of battles, Napoleon said they ended up capturing Moscow, but said like their position was untenable and had to retreat. And during the retreat, they lost more and more guys, basically running all the way back to France from Russia. Um, because along the way, then the army became disorganized, and it was more or less every man for himself. Units that stuck together managed to have a higher survival rate, but out of the 600,000 or so men that went into Russia from the Grand Armée, only about 100,000 made it back, with probably around 400,000 just dying, just straight up.
Mm.
And that's the horrifying experience. And the closest thing I could find that models to it in a recent game is again another Total War game, because of course it is. It's a Total War Napoleon, but the thing is about the Total War games is that they just really fail to show the human element, because in this, if you don't have the supplies, you'll just see your unit's numbers tick down a little bit every turn.
Mm.
You don't understand like the freezing to death or the starving or the being picked off by Cossack raiders, because that was a thing that happened on the way back, is that bands of roving Cossack raiders saw the French leaving as an opportunity to get loot for themselves. Not to mention the roving French deserters that also just started looting the countryside too, because that was a thing.
Yeah.
It was pretty terrible overall.
I think so getting into early modern and modern warfare like you're talking about. I'm wondering, now that we're talking about this, how much the uniform and formation fighting that became a thing, and therefore is, very overly represented in these video games. Like, if you're playing a Napoleonic themed game or an early modern European warfare game, everyone's going to be in uniform, everyone's going to be moving in formations and moving together, and it's very robotic and soulless. And I wonder if that goes some way to, eliminating that human element, and therefore the privations that these people are suffering, because in an effort to represent these games, accurately with correct national uniforms and correct formations, we're losing a bit of that, individual personality that might be present in a game dealing with, today's warfare, or something a little bit more fantastical. Because there's a Scourge of War, there's a Waterloo version, there's a Civil War game as well, and that struck me because you were talking about the Teutoburg Forest game or battle, where they zoom in, and that really helps set the tone. But one of the best ways to play Scourge of War, if you can, hack it and figure it out, is there's like a commander point of view where you're stuck on horseback and can only see it from that point of view, and you still feel nothing, because there's very little humanity in the sprites that are wandering around you and falling over, dying, and it still feels very abstracted.
And I think that like one sprite in that game represents like 10 guys anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh yes, my one friend over here, 10 guys. You can't. That's nothing.
Yeah, it's the abstraction of armies into paper soldier blocks in this period of games that might be contributing to the lack of empathy, I suppose, that we feel for our soldiers here.
Yeah, I would say that's something, because in a game like, for example, Ultimate General Civil War, where you get to customize your armies and place in command of them specific officers, and follow the units basically throughout your whole career. I felt nervous, or I guess scared, for those units when I saw them being overrun, or saw that the officer got killed, because you can form an attachment to them if they have a name, or you can do things with them. But if it's just unit number 57 just clobbered to death by a bunch of guys, then you don't really care. But I think that part of what lends games to this to the idea of horror, as they should to an extent, I think, is having the ability to interface with them more so than just telling them to go here, shoot that.
Mm-hmm. And that's hard to do, because something people want when you're playing a strategy game is control. and that's not something you generally get in militaries throughout the entirety of human history. Command and control has always been such an important issue. When you're playing a strategy game, it's harder to integrate that without introducing frustration. So the potential for misunderstandings or misdirection or fear or whatever kind of falls away, and you're left with a little bit more of a robotic version of what soldiers should be. and that goes a long
Yeah.
way in killing the horror.
I think that again, that's coming up that seems to be modeling this well is not Unity of Command, excuse me, Burden of Command, the World War II turn-based game. It looks like all of the NCOs and lieutenants for your company that you will be managing as like an in-game guy um, seem to be modeled to an extent. So you actually have an attachment to them, and they have their own personalities that can change over the course of the game. And I think that in something like that, you would feel a real emotional connection to seeing one of those guys die.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to that one because I feel like that's going to address a lot of the emotional issues I have with strategy games.
Yeah, me too. I think that for most of these games, sorrow and horror go hand in hand
Mm-hmm.
because it's just like, oh, you're watching this guy horribly die. He was cut in half by whatever thing. But a lot of the time, you don't really make a connection with these characters, which is unfortunate because I think that you could gain a lot from bringing in more of a human connection to these to the players' characters or people in the field.
Mm-hmm. I
I
agree.
mean, it's one of the reasons why like Dungeons and Dragons is so popular. Is like it's like in a form of escapism, but you can also have an emotional response to a lot of things that happen, and a lot of what happens in D&D can end up being sad or scary for the player. But I would say that ends up being a more rewarding experience because there is an emotional investment in what's going on. I can't say that frequently when I play a war game, there's much of an emotional investment in what's going on, other than me worrying that I might be wasting my time after I am losing something.
I mean, that's just part of the way we've decided to build war games, computer war games these days, because it's based on the traditional board game style of war games first and foremost, and that needed to be abstracted and made codifiable by rules that humans could follow, and therefore you have a lot of number-based systems, right? It's how we deal with randomization and all that. But I think that just makes me think of an example of ignoring the horror. We're talking to a friend of mine who plays Europe Universalis a lot, and he
Mm-hmm.
was playing Russia and therefore had lots of manpower and lots of trickleback for his manpower, and he was running around with an army of 1,000,000 men, which was
Oh
taking
boy.
excruciating attrition every turn. But he's like, no, it's fine because I take this much attrition, but I also get this much manpower back, so it kind of equals out, so no problem. I'm like, that's like tens of thousands of people are dying or deserting or whatever every second.
Yeah. And it's funny that you brought up EU4 because that's a game that also models like slavery and colonialism and I guess to an extent genocide in its own kind of way that you don't really think about it too much because it's just numbers.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I can't think of it being playable if it wasn't just numbers in that case.
Mm-hmm. It gets a
Because
bit
I mean,
harder to
I
click
would
on a change
yeah.
culture button.
Yeah, you click change culture and magically everyone speaks English now or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, that's preferable than thinking about the ethical ramifications. That's one case I would say that the horror is best left unincluded in the game.
Yeah, only because it has a potential to be abused by people who are into that. Because I remember with
Yeah.
Victoria 2, I played a game in South Africa as the Zulu Nation, and there were
Mhm.
pop-ups for like, do you want to genocide the Dutch? Because they'll give you more living space. And I'm like, well, that's, on the nose. But I haven't seen that in any other Paradox game since Victoria 2.
I think that Victoria 2 was the last time that Paradox was kind of a smaller studio and could get away with things that could be kind of spicy, I guess.
Mm,
And they can't really get away with that anymore. Not that I think that having that option was a bad idea back then, but it wouldn't be a good idea now for them because they would just get such a mass amount of flack for it.
yeah, it's the tricky part for me because the historian in me, I want to see that there because I don't like when people are hiding these horrible things happen. And if you're playing a game where you're trying to be efficient and win, and you're doing something horrible to do it, then do something horrible to do it, and be aware that that's how you get this result. Right? I expand my living space because I'm horribly murdering people. It's bad. It's a bad thing, and I'm the bad guy. But that's the game. The issue for me now is that so many of the unfortunate groups we talked about last time, the alt right gamer types,
Mm-hmm.
revel in that instead of taking it as a learning experience or as a potential for education. right? They enjoy the genocide, they enjoy the wiping out, and that's why you don't see these in these mainstream games anymore, because they don't want to give a platform to people who can sit there and do the Holocaust and be like, look at what I did. Yeah, I did the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. And it bothers me not so much that they don't include it, but that they need to not include it because of how it's being co-opted.
Yeah, I agree. You can still see some things like that in mods or whatever, but it's sometimes it comes across as gleeful, and that's like horrifying.
Yeah,
Uh,
for a different way.
yeah. Yeah, and you talked about it, how abstracting it does remove a lot of the attachment, but there is one game that I want to point out kind of is the outlier to this. It's DEF CON. I think it actually came out in like 2008 or something. I think I have it in my Steam so I could check, but it's from a while ago, and basically the entire gist of it is you are the commander of a section of the world like the US and Canada, South America, Eastern Asia, etc., or Europe, what have you, and you're basically in charge of the nukes and the fleets, and the game will just build up. You don't really have a say in like the politics of it too much unless you're playing a multiplayer team game. And uh, the gist of the game is that a nuclear confrontation is going to happen. See if you can kill more of their guys than they kill of your guys. If you lose less guys than you win, is essentially the gist of the game. So you set up air defense systems and fleets to try to intercept missiles, but then you see these little pixely missiles, because it's this game that looks like it's set on a 1980s kind of like computer, and you see these little missiles arc across the street, and then they hit a city, and then you see a number just show up that's like 15 million dead, and it's like, oh god, that just happened in my game. And I think that that's the closest a war game has made me come to feeling like legitimately like afraid, is that moment when the first time that happened in a DEF CON game that I was playing.
Yeah, so I like that they posit the win condition as, who can suffer the least. Because then it's
Yeah.
already in your head, like, this is going to be bad. And then when you see it happen, it's bad. And the only way you can win is by losing the least. And that's, a
Hmm.
good way to look at a lot of conflict in strategy games, right? And we don't see it that way. It's always in the more traditional military objectives of, can we take X territory? Can we achieve Y political goal? And when you're reducing it to that, who can suffer the least, that kind of drives home that this is what we're doing to get where we want to be in these other games, is that this is about the inflicting of suffering on human beings.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's a cool one. That's a good one to point out, because that one is about as abstract as you can get for an actual game, yet it somehow manages to hammer in that humanity more than a lot of these other games, who are much closer to the actual physical action, seem to do.
Yeah, I would say so. One other game I wanted to bring up is one I actually just thought of just now, is at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of abstractness, is Dwarf Fortress,
Oh yeah,
because it's not so much of a traditional war game, but every single character in the game, yours or a non-player controlled character, is modeled to an extreme degree, including their personalities, their thoughts, what they look like, and everything. And when combat occurs in that game, that is, you can be really emotionally attached to your dwarves, because you can know what they think about things, you can know what they look like, you can know who they're related to, what their relationships are, and then you dig too deep into the ground, and then a demon from the actual hell shows up and just disembowels them in front of like all of their friends. And that's horrifying. And the game actually models this, and as we said earlier, not many games do. If dwarves get too upset, they can more or less develop personality disorders for an amount of time, and they'll just kind of go berserk on their own. And a famous thing in the Dwarf Fortress community is losing people to mood spirals, where they'll get depressed and either refuse to work, or they will snap and start beating up people or breaking buildings or whatever. And I think that that's kind of at the other end of the spectrum in terms of how a game should handle the reality of horror in a situation like that.
I love that you bring that up, because totally independent of this, I was talking to my wife about Dwarf Fortress a couple days ago.
I love Dwarf Fortress so much.
Yeah, it's such a great game, but specifically the combat and how they don't do an HP bar or HP
Hmm.
level style combat system, but they actually have, like you're saying, like every section of the dwarf model down to the skin, muscle,
Like
fat,
the
and bones.
toenails. Yeah.
Yeah, and after a fight, you go and read through the combat logs, and it's horrific because they're actually fighting, and you can see. Right, he drove the hammer into the skull, cracking the skull, bruising the flesh, and popping the
Yeah,
eyeball.
and
And
then like the skull pieces went into the brain and fractured the brain or whatever. Like that stuff is modeled.
yeah, and that it does something that I think media just doesn't do in general is, however abstractly, because it's Dwarf Fortress and you're just reading text, but it shows you the actual consequences of violence. And we just don't get that in any games, really. Well, very, very few
Yeah.
games that actually do that. Because if they live, they still have to deal with that.
Oh yeah, you have to have a whole medical system set up. One of the dwarves in one of my forts ended up going around for life as like the champion combatant of my fort ended up going around for life like on a splint because like the bottom half of her leg had just been cut off. So
Mhm.
she was just using her oh geez, what are those things called that you walk on when you're hurt?
Crutches?
Crutches. Yeah, she was using crutches basically for the rest of the whole game until I accidentally forgot to shut the door one time when the goblins showed up.
But yeah, I mean that highlights the battles are a lot more impactful when your dwarves, like we are talking about with the other games. If you knew the characters, it makes them more important. But also seeing the physical ramifications of violence and conflict is something that we just don't get in games or even in movies, right? You don't really people get shot and they fall over, and you don't have that 2 minutes of thinking they're going to be okay before the blood loss catches up with them, or these horrible things that happen in reality when people inflict violence upon each other. Dwarf Fortress actually does that, and it's you know might sound silly coming from a game that's ASCII, but it does a better job, I think, of reinforcing the horrors of violence and horrors of war than a lot of other games do.
Yeah, I think that a line that a lot of games are trying to not cross in terms of not showing this stuff is they don't want to revel in it too much, which is something I can understand because a lot of games don't want to end up being like Tarantino levels of like reveling in misery or whatever. Not every game wants to be the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, where it's Omaha Beach and people's limbs are getting blown off or whatever, and it's just miserable. You know,
Mm-hmm.
not every game wants to do that, and that's something I can respect. But at the same time, I think that sometimes a disservice is being done to the conflict and using it as a potential learning tool to not show these things.
Yeah, see that hits on something that is like an eternal debate within me, because part of me is 100% with that. Yeah, you don't need to always revel in the violence because that's you come home from a long day at work and you want to play a strategy game and think about things and get invested in some history, and that's fine. But on the other hand, I feel like that elevates the applying video game logic to real life issues problem that anyone can see if they spend 2 minutes looking at any YouTube video talking about a military history topic. Like I've done several videos for military history not visualized, and looking at how people in the comments respond to those videos. Not everyone, a lot of people are really good, obviously, but how some people respond to the comments in those videos and other videos about tanks, about military equipment, all that. There is this overwhelming feeling of statistics and video game logic being applied to these real life wars. Like you have people debating tanks and talking about, shells and armor width and whatnot as if it's the be all end all understanding why and how these things worked. And that just ignores the humanity of the fighting. And I wonder how much these sanitized versions of battles we get in TV, in movies, and books, and then in video games contribute to that kind of that cleaning of conflict into a sterile set of statistics that you can use to break down what the better tank is or who the better fighter is. All these abstract things that rely on 1.5 million real world components to actually come together, but are being reduced to he's got the bigger gun, therefore they're better. That kind
Yeah,
of thinking.
yeah, and it a lot of things just ignore the human element entirely, which I guess is kind of the point of this episode is the human element being the key to both emotional attachment and understanding these on a deeper level. And I think that the human element is something that a lot of games ignore. I mean, for example, like let's take a look at like Hearts of Iron. That's something that we've talked about a lot recently. In the game, every soldier from every different combatant is the exact same no matter which one he's from. They're all one man. If the only thing that can differ is the equipment that they have or the amount of experience that they have. Nothing else is taken into account when it comes to calculating things. So even if, I mean, you can't model in the training, you can't model in the background for every person. That would be ridiculous. But I feel like it leaves something to be desired, saying that a German soldier and an American soldier and a Soviet soldier and a Japanese soldier and a Chinese soldier are all the exact same guy. They're just from different places. And I think that that's doing a disservice to learning more about the conflict. And oh man, I said that and I'm just like, oh man, this is going to sound kind of racist. I hope it doesn't sound racist.
I know what you're trying to say, but and yeah, that's part of the abstraction of militaries into comprehensible statistics that I feel is detrimental to understanding the actual history of these wars.
Yeah.
Because when you do a video, they're like I did a video on the Boxer War, and some of the comments on the first couple of videos were very like absolutist with and very egregious in ignoring everything I said in talking about how, well, the Boxers did this, this, and this, therefore they were less a military force than the European troops who did X, Y, and Z. And my point was that was not even the point of my video. Like, I was not trying to, compare the military abilities in a D&D sheet of these different armies. I want to explain why this conflict happened. But that's that kind of trying to take something complicated and reduce it into something that is totally understandable, which means definable, which means, numbers driven, I guess, which I think we inherit a lot from video games, especially.
Yeah.
Because that is how we have to deal with the conflicts and problem solve in these games.
Well, I think that, it's something to be said there is that a lot of the things that people deal with today are such abstract problems and people want to simplify them. Like everything that people face is like a lot of the popular pundits or figureheads for political movements just simplify things down to an extreme, to an extent that doesn't make any sense, but it appeals to what people want to feel, which is like, oh, this is a simple concept I can get behind, as opposed to the nitty gritty of the reality of the situation. People don't want to think about the details. It's not something that I think the average person is driven to do unless it's a thing that they're specifically super interested in.
Yeah, and I suppose in all this complaining I'm doing, it doesn't really help, wargaming as a hobby, because people want to learn about these things and want to engage with these things without having to deal with this unpleasantness. And me saying that it's not good enough doesn't help at all, right? Like I understand that the abstraction is needed and sometimes beneficial. I suppose I just want my cake and want to eat it too.
I guess. I don't know. I think that games as an abstract can still bring in elements of this. Just bring in the human element to make it more appropriate. As we said last time, some games, like the one game I mentioned, Decisive Campaigns, that has the letters from one of your soldiers on the front to show like there is a human person out there who's fighting and will die if you mess up. Or like in the case of DEF CON, that doesn't even have that, but it has other game factors to make you feel something for the 20 million people that just got blown up in your city or whatever, or the 20 million people that you just blew up on the other side of the planet. There's ways to do it, I think. And I don't think it's bad to say we want to see more of this, because I mean, the first steps to getting a change done would be someone, maybe two podcasters, saying we want to see more of this. I mean, so someone out there will listen to this and have their opinion changed, and maybe that man is John Paradox, who runs all of the Paradox Studios. Who knows?
Oh yes, the fabled John Paradox.
The fabled John Paradox.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess you're right. What we can do, aside from learning how to code, is say, yeah, I think it's important that we start addressing these things in games because it offers an unprecedented opportunity for players to really engage on a very tactile level with the wars they're playing, and therefore the horrors that these wars entail, when before it might be simpler, easier to just see them as an abstraction of numbers, statistics, uniforms, and formations.
Right. Yeah, the logical conclusion of this podcast is that we both just code a game together.
Right. No, I'll crack out the C# book and we'll get
Oh
started.
no, don't make me go back to Java. I don't want to go back.
I'm a writer. I'm not a coder. Don't worry. I don't think I have the brain for
Me too.
math.
Well, if you're out there and you're listening and you know how to code a video game, you can come on our podcast. Just be sure to hit us up at let's talk about wargames at gmail.com.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. Start a studio.
Yeah.
Happy Halloween, everyone.
Yeah, but happy Halloween. Let's rate a horror war game. A horror. No, I don't want to say that. Let's make a game.
Well, I mean, I think that is a not quite the place I thought we'd end up for our Halloween episode, but I like it. It's a looking forward. You know, after the horror movie, the darkness breaks and you see the sunlight, and you walk into the distance to commission a horrific war game.
Yes, a horrible war game. But like it's scary. It's not bad. I mean,
Yeah.
it could be bad. I can't say it as for how good it's going to be yet.
Yes, it's purely hypothetical game. No,
This
I think
hypothetical game that I'm already staking my futures in.
it'll be the best horrible war game, and you
Yeah.
can take whatever meaning of that you want, dear listener.
Okay, well, I think that about does it for our special episode today, Joe. You have any closing thoughts to share with folks here?
No, just thanks as usual for tuning in to listen to us. We do like when we hear from you guys on Discords or an email or in the YouTube comments, so keep it coming. We're going to keep doing what we do, and thanks for the support.
Yeah, appreciate it so much. So yeah, as usual, you can find us at Jack_Trumbull at twitter.com. That is my @ and at Joe Fonseca Hist. That is JoeFonsecaHist at the twitter.com. I'm not giving you my other social media handles. Sorry, everyone. But
I
that's
think one's enough.
Them's the breaks. If you like what we do, as Joe said, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Send me some Halloween candy. I particularly like Three Musketeers. If you have any, send some my way. That would be cool. Just hit us up at the email. I'll give you a post box or something.
Oh, I forgot.
Oh,
we should talk about this. We're having a blog get set up and sorted.
Yes, we are.
That's big.
A horrible surprise at the end of the episode. Horrible, not a bad one.
It's full of, it's just nothing but Halloween jokes and puns. That's it. Nothing to do with the podcast at all.
There's ghouls and goblins galore in it.
But no, actually, we are doing a blog which is going to contain game reviews, opinion pieces. I'm going to throw up a lot of the stuff I wrote in a past life on historical war games in education, if you're interested in that at all. Yeah, it's going to be full of a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to fluff it out and hopefully start linking it so people who are interested in reading what we have to say, not just listening to it, can pop over there as well.
Yeah, we'll also put links to this on there and, maybe links to related things. Joe, you're on military history not visualized pretty often. I mean, we could probably post those there as well.
Oh, yeah, which will be fun.
Yeah, and so be on the lookout for our blog, which is not Halloween themed at all, but will be Wargame themed.
Yes.
Okay, well, this time for real, take care, everyone. We hope you have yourselves a great Halloween, eat lots of candy, and please be safe on this COVID Eve.
Yeah, be safe, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.